Okay, so we're going to do our first lesson today. This is going to be on genetic variation. This is going to be the exact same lesson that we did the day before the whole class cancellation thing happened. So it's going to seem very familiar to you. But regardless of whether this seems familiar to you or not, please just make sure that you're taking either notes or you're collaborating on taking notes or whatever you feel that you need to be doing in order to make sure that you're really understanding this stuff. But anyway, let's just get started here. Here's today's plan. We're going to begin to talk about how we can predict the genetic information that gets passed from a parent to offspring. This isn't just with human beings, of course. This is also going to be with all animals, all plants, fungus, etc., right? All living things. So some of the things we're going to talk with this is DNA and genes. What's the difference? Oftentimes those two things are used interchangeably. We'll talk about the difference between the two. We'll talk about heredity and genetics. We'll talk about genes that can be passed on versus genes that can't be passed on. We'll talk about genes that are variable versus genes that are discrete. That'll make more sense when we get there. That probably means nothing to you right now. Then we'll talk about dominant genes versus recessive genes, as well as how to predict the characteristics of offspring. That last point in particular is what we're really going to focus on Monday. There's going to be a cool activity that I wanted to get to, of course, before this whole ordeal happened, but we'll get to it when we get to it. Anyway, let's roll. So first things first, DNA and genes. Your DNA is a unique blueprint that maps out your physical character traits. Your DNA is yours alone. So believe it or not, and we did have a little conversation of this when we talked about it in class, even if you are a twin, your DNA is actually unique compared to your twins, right? Twins don't actually have completely identical DNA. It's about as close as DNA can be to being identical, but there are some slight differences between twins' DNA, right? And that just happens as life goes on. Uh, Around birth, it's pretty close as far as I'm aware, but again, it can deviate as time goes on. Now, your DNA contains segments of chemical sequences called genes. So right there is the difference. Your DNA is the entire strand, whereas genes are just certain segments of that entire strand of DNA, right? Now, genes are each responsible for a specific function in making an individual who they are. For example, you'll have perhaps a gene for brown hair. So one of these sections, or maybe multiple of these sections, might be a whole long list of codes, is what is responsible, sorry, for your brown hair. If you have long legs, that could be something that could be part of your genes, right? So your genes might actually be explaining why you have long legs. And again, genes are just one component of your DNA. Next up, heredity and genetics. You'll probably remember this picture. We kind of had a chuckle about this. The passing on of traits from parents to offspring is called heredity. So when parents pass on their genetic material and have offspring, that is heredity. Now, the branch of science that deals with heredity is called genetics. So when you talk about genetic research, those are the scientists that are actually looking into how, of course, genes are passed on. Now, the reason I picked this picture in particular is because genes can be expressed in different ways depending on who the parents are and how the offspring turn out. So in this picture, of course, you can very clearly see whose genetic material is being better expressed in their children, right? Like poor dad there, he doesn't look hardly anything like his kids, but the kids all look like clones of their own mother, which is quite funny. But anyway, moving on. Heritable versus non-heritable characteristics. Heritable characteristics are anything that's passed on from one generation to the next, right? So if you can inherit them, right? If you can inherit some traits, then they are heritable traits, okay? So some examples of heritable traits, of course, I'm sure you could probably list a lot of these just in your own imagination, would be your eye color, right? Generally speaking, kids have an eye color that is more similar to their parents. Now, there's more details to that than can be explained right at the moment, but it is a good rule of thumb. Your hair color is also a heritable characteristic that is passed on from one generation to the next. Skin color is a big one, of course, and hair type, so whether you have straight hair or curly hair, that kind of thing, that is also a heritable characteristic. Now, non-heritable characteristics, these are also probably pretty clear for most of us. These are the ones that are not passed on from generation to generation. These are things that are acquired just through life, right? So your ability to play an instrument, like the kid on the right there who's jamming out to like that Men at Work song, Who Can It Be Now? That would be an acquired characteristic, or in other words, a non-heritable characteristic. Just because, let's say, his parents can play an instrument really well, doesn't mean that he can as well. The ability to play an instrument is not heritable. It is a non-heritable characteristic. Scars, of course, those are non-heritable. And dyed hair, that should be pretty obvious. Those aren't heritable characteristics. They're things that you acquire through life. Now, with inherited stuff, so in other words, from heritable characteristics, maybe I'll just write that out. For the heritable characteristics, there we go. There's actually two general different types of heritable characteristics. There's the ones that are called continuous or continuous variation. Continuous variation is when there's a whole range of possibilities. You're not just one or the other or another type, right? There's a whole different range. So think of things like height or mass or hair color. There isn't just explicit different examples. You're not just tall or short, for example. You can be anywhere in between. It's a whole spectrum of things, right? That's called continuous variation because you can have practically an infinite different possible characteristics that are unique to yourself just in relation to your height, right? So in other words, one person might be 5'4" and someone else might be 5'5", but there's even a range in between, right? You can be 5'4.5". You could be 5'4.75", right? There's not discrete different levels. It's just continuous. There's a whole different range. Mass, of course, is another big one. Mass is not only heritable characteristics, there's non-heritable characteristics related to mass, of course, as well. But generally speaking, certain body types are passed on from one generation to another. But of course, environmental factors can play a role in that as well. Anyway, now the other type of inherited variation is discrete variation. So discrete is a bit of a weird word that basically just means like one piece at a time. This is the either or form of a characteristic. So when you have discrete variation, that's where there's just a few different options to choose from. Sometimes only two different options, right? So some of the examples we looked at in class is blood type. There's positive blood types and negative blood types, but really there's only a certain number of overall blood types that someone can have. Your biological sex is also something that is discrete. You're either male or female biologically speaking. So that is the only kind of variation that exists there. And then another really interesting one that we looked at was the ability to curl your tongue, right? So if you can curl your tongue, like in this picture shows right here, that's one type of, believe it or not, inherited characteristic. But if you can't roll your tongue without like actually physically using your fingers to do it, that would also be a type, right? There's not really an in-between. There's not like, oh, I can sort of roll my tongue. If you can get your tongue to kind of form this U shape, even just a little bit, like even if your tongue kind of just like goes like that, right? That's still one type of variation, right? So it is discrete. It's not going to be continuous. Next up, environmental variation. I don't think when we did this discussion in class, I don't think we got quite this far with it. We kind of got in a deeper conversation with some of the other stuff. But environmental variation is where your traits are actually affected by the environment that you live in, right? So for some examples here, malnutrition, in other words, not getting the proper nutrients, not having a proper diet, can cause a child who has tall parents, which is usually a heritable characteristic, to end up growing up short, right? So if they don't get the nutrients they need, they're not going to actually achieve the same traits that their parents had, even though usually it would be a heritable characteristic. Another example would be if you had a plant that came from very healthy parents, and yes, plants do have parents too, of course. A plant from very healthy parents can still wither if it doesn't get what it needs, right? So the environmental factors still play a role in determining what traits really get expressed. I really like this picture that I found. Of course, it's a world map, and countries on this world map are color-coded based on the average male height per country. It might be a little hard for you to read that in the YouTube video. I'm not sure how this is going to look on your end, but I can interpret it for you. Any of the red countries, and the darker red you go, the higher up it gets, but any of the red countries are the countries where the average male height is actually on the higher end of average, right? So if we look at Canada right here, of course, it looks like the average male height in Canada corresponds to this color right here, which is 5'9". So the average male in Canada is probably around 5'9". If you look at some of these countries in Europe, I believe that's Norway and Sweden. I think Norway is the one on the outside edge and then Sweden's the one in the middle here. This one's Finland, I know that for sure. But Norway and Sweden, they look like they're more between 5'11" and 6 feet tall, right? So they're darker red. They're some of the taller countries. On the other end, though, the blue countries, or even this bottom color, which looks more black to me, those are the countries where the average male height is shorter, right? So even if you look at Mexico right here in that dark blue color, that corresponds with an average male height of only 5'5", right? This is most likely caused by some environmental factors, at least for the most part. There might be some biological heritable characteristics in some of these locations, but if you honestly look at this world map, there seems to be a correlation between countries that are rather wealthy, like Canada and the United States and most of Europe, and countries that suffer with poverty, like most of the countries, of course, in Africa as well as the Middle East, right? Those countries, generally speaking, are shorter, probably because mostly an issue with nutrition, right? That would be the correlation that exists there. Anyway, moving on. Question is, why are only some traits passed on? Well, when genes are passed from a parent to offspring, the offspring receives half of the overall gene from each parent. Okay, so genes are often broken into two different chunks called alleles. Okay, people, generally speaking, this is a very big generalization here, but people, generally speaking, will have two alleles for each of their genes. And this is about like as simple as we can put it. So if you have a gene for your hair color, let's say, so if you have a gene for your hair color, there's going to be two different pieces of it, right? And each of those pieces are called alleles. You get one from your mom and you get one from your dad, right? Now, dominant traits are traits that will always show up in the offspring. The allele is named with an uppercase letter. Usually alleles are just one letter long when we list them out. An uppercase allele is a dominant character trait. So for example, brown hair, which is a dominant character trait, that would be represented by a capital B. All right, just bear with me for now. This might be a little confusing, but just bear with me. Recessive traits are the traits that will not show up if another dominant trait is present. So in other words, recessive traits only show up in a gene, in the whole thing, like hair color, if only recessive traits are expressed as alleles. If there's a single dominant trait, the recessive trait goes out the window. Now the allele, when it's a recessive trait, is actually named with a lowercase letter. So for example, blonde hair, which is a recessive trait, would be named with a lowercase b, right? So if you had someone who had their hair color gene, I'll just write it out again here. So this is your hair color gene. If you have brown hair, it's possible that your two alleles are a capital B and a capital B. You have a dominant brown hair allele that makes up your whole hair color gene. But it's also possible, if you have brown hair, that perhaps you have a capital B, so your dominant brown hair, but also a lowercase b allele. It's just with that lowercase allele being a recessive trait, it's getting overthrown by this dominant trait, and therefore you still have brown hair. If you have blonde hair, on the other hand, the only way that your gene could be set up is if you have two blonde recessive genes, because there's no dominant character trait that's going to knock that out the window, okay? Let's look at some examples here really quick. So this picture might be a little bit hard to read. I'll try to reinterpret it for you. This is just showing a bunch of different gene characteristics, both dominant and recessive. The one here up in the top left is showing dark hair versus light hair. So what they used for their allele letters, and again, it's all arbitrary, you can use whatever letters you want, is they said this person with dark hair, which is a dominant trait, is either an LL, two capital L's, right, two dominant traits, or they're a capital L and a lowercase l, right? Because either way, whether it's this way or this way, the dominant trait is what you end up seeing. This person here with light hair, though, would have two lowercase l's because they only have the recessive light hair gene, okay? Some other examples of dominant traits would be curly hair versus straight hair. So curly hair is actually dominant over straight hair. So they used, for whatever reason, the letter T to represent the hair type. I guess T for type, I just realized it now. So two capital T's would give you curly hair. But if you had a capital T and a lowercase t, it would also give you curly hair. The only way that you would have straight hair is if you had two recessive straight hair genes. Now, the next one is the ability to curl your tongue. As we mentioned earlier, the ability to curl your tongue is a dominant character trait. They use the letter C to represent that. So two capital C's would represent the ability to curl your tongue, but also a capital C and a lowercase c. If you had that recessive gene, you still can curl your tongue. So the whole idea here, I know it's getting a little out of hand, so I'll just whip through the rest of this real quick, is if you have a dominant character trait, that is represented by a capital letter allele. Whereas if you have a recessive character trait, it's represented by a lowercase allele. And for all of your genes, whether it's your hair color, your hair type, your ability to curl your tongue, anything like that, it is going to be represented by two different alleles. So again, just to finish this off real quick, I won't write anything else out. Mid-digital hair, that's just a fancy way of saying like hair pretty much on the tips of your fingers here, right? That's actually a dominant character trait, right? So in other words, that would dominate over the recessive where you don't have any mid-digital hair. Eye color, of course, has dominant recessive. Dark eyes, like brown eyes, that is a dominant trait, whereas blue eyes or even green eyes, those are recessive traits. And then the last one is something called a widow's peak. If you ever notice, like right along your hairline, some people have like this little V-shaped point right on the very front, right in between their two eyes. That's called a widow's peak, and that's a dominant character trait. If you don't have that, like if you have like a totally straight, flat hairline, or if your hairline's kind of just curved like that, that is not a widow's peak. That is a recessive character trait. Anyway, we're almost done here. Just a few last things, just a few terminology pieces for us to understand. Is with those allele components, there's two different ways we can break this down. There's purebred, and I don't really like that term so much. I prefer the scientific term of homozygous. Homozygous means you have either two capital letter alleles or two lowercase alleles, right? So in other words, if you had two capital letter alleles, so two dominant alleles for your hair color, it'd be capital B, or if you had two recessive, it'd be lowercase b, lowercase b. That's called being homozygous. And breaking down that word homozygous, remember, homo means the same, right? So two letters that are the same, okay? If you are a quote-unquote hybrid, which again, I just think that's a weird term. I prefer the scientific term of heterozygous. This is where your gene is actually one capital letter and one lowercase letter. Or in other words, you have one dominant trait and one recessive trait. So for example, a capital B and a lowercase b. So again, if B was a dominant, or sorry, capital B was a dominant brown hair allele and lowercase b was a recessive blonde hair allele, then both capital B, and capital B, lowercase b, both of those people would have brown hair because the dominant brown hair gene, or brown hair allele, my mistake, takes over, whereas this person with two lowercase b's would have blonde hair, okay? Anyway, almost done here. Phenotype and genotype. These are the last pieces of terminology that we need to understand. This basically just talks about the difference between what you see and what your genetic component is. We don't really know, without doing a genetic test, what your genetic component is. So what your alleles are for each of your genes. You wouldn't actually know that 100% sure unless you did a genetic test, or unless you, of course, had recessive traits being expressed. Two different terms that go with this are phenotype and genotype. Now, a phenotype is what actually shows up in an offspring. So in other words, it's what you visibly see in the offspring. So your phenotype, if you had brown hair, for instance, would be, well, brown hair. Your phenotype is what you see. I always remembered it by saying, okay, phenotype begins with PH. Another word that begins with PH is photo. Photo, what you see is what you see, right? So photo, phenotype, that's how I always remembered that. Genotype, however, is your genetic characteristics of the offspring. And again, that's not always visible, especially if you have dominant characteristics. So for example, if you have a brown hair allele, capital B, and a blonde hair allele, a lowercase b, that is your genotype. So in other words, what your gene actually looks like based on its alleles. So you have two different alleles in this case. Your gene is a capital B, lowercase b. That is also called your genotype. Now, if you have brown hair, you might have this as your genotype, but you might also have this as your genotype, whether you're heterozygous or homozygous. So again, this picture showing some birds. I don't know if there's like it looks like a flamingo to me. I don't know if there's like a blue flamingo. Maybe I'm totally wrong here. I just found this picture and I thought, you know what, this is a good way of showing it. A homozygous dominant trait, of course, two capital A's, it's this dominant pink color. Heterozygous would be that dominant trait and a recessive trait. Still looks exactly the same as the homozygous one. But then, of course, you have a homozygous recessive where there's two of the same, homo meaning same, right? Two of the same recessive trait. That's what you're seeing here. So this is your genotype, capital A, genotype here. Whereas what you actually see is your phenotype, okay? All right, so for some practice, just work on those 5 questions on page 29. Hopefully it shouldn't take you too long. I just noticed the amount of time I've gone on here. I'm about at 20 minutes now. Just to let you know, the Zoom conference is what we're doing tomorrow. It's going to be from 11 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Again, tomorrow being Friday. We're going to start it right at 11 o'clock a.m. You are allowed to join a few minutes early. So if you want to start at, like, let's say 10:57, if you want to log on at like 10:57, that's totally okay. We're going to be starting right at like 11 o'clock sharp. So make sure you're there on there when you can be. Now, I'm not going to tell you in this video, and I'm not going to post in the comment or anything, what the Zoom conference link is. That is on Google Classroom. I'd rather you go on Google Classroom to get that. And the whole point of the Zoom conference we're going to have tomorrow is we're going to go over these 5 questions. And maybe we'll even briefly discuss the next thing that we're going to learn if we have time. It kind of links in exactly what we were talking today, especially with dominant traits versus recessive traits. But that's basically where we're at. Anyway, hopefully this makes sense, guys. If you have any questions, please send me an email or send me a remind or post a question on Classroom. I know this is a little bit of a weird start. This is new to me too. It's kind of uncomfortable doing this, not going to lie, but you know what? We'll adapt. We'll get better as time goes on. And if you have anything you'd like to tell me, just let me know. Even if you say, hey, you know what? Maybe try this next time. I'm more than willing to listen to that. Anyway, best of luck, guys. Work on these 5 questions. And I guess I'll see you tomorrow on Zoom at 11 o'clock a.m. Thanks.